Usually when we talk about changing the world or fixing these massive societal problems, the conversation inevitably drifts toward the ballot box.
Right. It's always about voting or policy reform.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a protest here and there. It's that usual grind of trying to tweak the system from the inside.
It is the standard political playbook. You lobby, you campaign, and you just sort of hope for a slightly better version of the status quo.
But today we are looking at something completely different for this deep dive.
Very different.
We are diving into a proposal that explicitly states that we need to forget politics. It literally calls politics a trap.
Yeah, the source material we are exploring today proposes, and this sounds like science fiction at first, using advanced math and industrial engineering to basically build a back door out of civilization as we know it.
It is a radical departure from the norm, and they call this a structural prison break.
That metaphor is so key here. It's not about protesting the prison conditions or, asking the warden for better food. It's about getting your hands on the architectural blueprints, finding the structural flaws in the walls, and engineering a tunnel out.
And it is wild stuff to read through. We aren't just talking about living off the grid in a cabin with a wood stove somewhere.
No, not at all.
We are talking about everything from giant robotic assembly cubes to literally rewriting the legal code so it functions like computer software.
And the stated goal of all this is a transition from dependency on the state to what the source calls absolute technical and epistemic sovereignty.
Which is a very dense way of saying you own your own reality.
Exactly. From the calories you consume to laws you follow, you own it. You simply don't ask for permission.
So buckle up. We are going to unpack a plan that treats civilization not as a society to be governed, but as an engineering problem to be solved.
And every engineering problem starts with a diagnosis. You have to know what is broken before you can fix it.
Right.
This proposal starts with a very bold and honestly quite confrontational claim, which is that scarcity is a lie.
The manufactured scarcity argument, I think a lot of you listening might bristle at that immediately.
Because rent is high, food is expensive, energy bills are climbing. Scarcity feels incredibly real when you check your bank account.
Oh, the pain of scarcity is real, and the source isn't denying that you are paying more.
Right, but it argues that the reason you are struggling isn't because the earth has run out of stuff. It argues that scarcity is a politically engineered architecture.
Okay, let's look at the evidence they provide for that. Because that is a massive claim to just throw out there.
Well, look at agriculture. The source pulls data showing that global agriculture already produces enough calories to feed over 10 billion people.
So we are well past the threshold of needing anyone to go hungry.
Exactly. Or look at water. We have the physics to solve water shortages right now through desalination.
But desalination is incredibly energy intensive. That's usually the counter argument, right? That we can't do it because it costs too much energy.
Yes, but then the source points to energy itself. We have the technology for effectively unlimited energy via small modular reactors.
SMRs.
Right. The text argues that these technologies are bottlenecked entirely by regulation, not by physics.
So we could have cheap energy, but legal structures prevent it just to maintain a hierarchy of dependence.
That is the core argument. The source describes the state as an abstraction of coercion.
An abstraction of coercion.
Yeah, it's a mechanism that artificially restricts supply to maintain control. Because if energy was too cheap or food was too abundant, you wouldn't need the structure that currently manages those resources.
This is where the source gets deeply philosophical about what the state actually is. They mention this concept of paraconsistent logic.
Yes.
I actually had to look this one up. Can you break this down for us?
I can. It's a concept from logic that deals with contradictions. In classical logic, if you have a contradiction, the whole system just falls apart. But paraconsistent logic allows a system to function despite containing contradictions. And the source argues the state operates on exactly this kind of contradiction.
Meaning it demands you follow the rules, but it explicitly exempts itself from those same rules.
Exactly. Give an example of that contradiction in action.
Well, the classic one the source brings up is violence. The state says do not kill, but it wages war.
Yeah.
It says do not steal, but it levies taxes. And the source, taking a very libertarian view here, characterizes taxation as rent-seeking.
But here is the kicker. Because the state exempts itself, it creates a system where compliance for the citizen is impossible to perfectly achieve.
The rules are designed to be shifting so that the authority is always necessary.
Yes, and the source connects us directly to James C. Scott,
the author of Seem Like a State.
That's a crucial reference in this document. Scott's work details how centralized governments hate complexity.
Because real human systems are messy. How a village organizes its farming, or how a forest grows organically.
They are very hard to count, tax, and control. So the state tries to make them legible. They force them into simple grids.
Like clear-cutting a highly diverse forest just to plant a grid of pine trees because it's easier to count the timber.
Exactly. And in doing so, they often completely destroy the local functional ecosystem.
So the source argues that our current economy is basically a simplified grid that is fragile and inefficient, kept in place only by force.
They also bring in Amartya Sen here, the Nobel Prize winner.
Sen is definitely a heavy hitter for this argument.
He proved mathematically that modern famines are almost never caused by a lack of food.
They are failures of distribution and entitlements, right?
Yes. The food exists, but the political will, or the economic mechanism to let people eat it, does not.
And the source takes this and says, okay, if scarcity is enforced by market capitalism and state regulation, which Murray Bookchin also argued, then the solution isn't to ask the state to be nicer.
No, the solution is to make the state completely irrelevant.
Which brings us to their version of civil disobedience. But we are not talking about marching in the street with a sign here.
No, they view protesting as begging. The text calls for civil disobedience defined as the transparent construction of parallel technologies.
Meaning if you build a machine that creates abundance right in your backyard, you don't need to protest for lower prices.
You have simply engineered your way out of the market. You make the existing system obsolete.
So let's talk about those machines, because this is the part where the proposal shifts from high-level philosophy to something that feels like a makerspace on absolute steroids.
They call for an industrial stack. It is basically a hardware kit for civilization.
They actually call it RISC-V for civilization.
Right.
And for those listening who aren't techies, RISC-V is an open-source processor architecture. It is a chip design that anyone can use without paying royalties to big tech companies.
Precisely. They want to do for physical factories what RISC-V did for computer chips.
The goal is to stop rent-seeking. The source cites a statistic claiming that citizens currently surrender about 32.8% of their income to the landed gentry.
Basically, rent and mortgages. To stop that bleeding, you have to capture the means of physical production. You have to build your own house and your own stuff.
But obviously, you can't just wish a factory into existence. They have a specific method for this called GBOP.
Which sounds like a cartoon robot.
It really does, but I know it's actually some serious math.
It stands for Generalized Industrial Bootstrap Optimization Problem. This is using a branch of mathematics called mixed integer linear programming.
Okay, let's unpack that. Mixed integer linear programming.
Think of it like the ultimate resource management video game. You have a goal, which is to build a civilization.
And you have constraints. Limited money, limited space, limited energy.
Mixed integer programming helps you solve for yes or no decisions. Do I buy this machine or that one? Do I build a forge or a saw?
So GBOP is basically an algorithm designed to figure out the seed set.
The seed set, yes. What is the absolute minimum number of tools you need to build all other tools?
If you optimize the math correctly, you find the most efficient path from having nothing to having full industrial capacity.
It is like the ultimate survival game. You start with a rock, make a hammer, use the hammer to make a chisel.
But here, they aren't starting with rocks. They are starting with some very specific high-tech machines.
They are.
I really want to geek out on the 5-axis CNC workhorse mentioned in the text, because this isn't your standard high school shop class mill.
Not at all. What stood out to you about the specs on that one?
The materials. They propose building the frame out of epoxy granite. That is synthetic rock.
It is brilliant engineering. Usually heavy industrial machines are made of cast iron.
Which is heavy, expensive to ship, and requires a massive foundry to cast.
Right. But epoxy granite is just a mix of granite aggregate rocks, sand, and epoxy resin. You can cast it at room temperature right in a garage.
And what about the performance?
It is actually better than iron in one key metric, which is vibration damping.
Because when you are cutting metal, the machine vibrates. And if it vibrates too much, your cuts are sloppy.
Exactly. Epoxy granite absorbs those vibrations up to 10 times better than cast iron.
So you get a significantly more precise machine for a fraction of the money.
Much less money. The source claims this approach reduces the capital cost from a standard $42,000 machine down to somewhere between $8,000 and $14,000.
Wow.
And because you are generating your own electricity, which we will get to in a minute, the operational cost is estimated at just 27 cents an hour.
27 cents an hour to run a factory-grade machine. That changes the economics of production completely. You could just leave it running all night making parts.
That is exactly the point. Manufacturing becomes a background utility, like running a dishwasher.
You don't count the labor cost of your dishwasher, it just runs.
Exactly.
They also mention a robotic assembly cube. This thing sounds like an absolute beast, a 40-foot frame printer with 8 robot arms inside.
It's a microfactory in a box. The source describes a smart tube pipeline.
Okay, how does that work?
Imagine a machine where you feed in raw steel tubing at one end. Inside the cube, the machine automatically notices where the cuts need to be, lasers on dark codes for tracking, bends the steel, and welds it.
So it can just build the structural frame of a building entirely automatically.
Yes, it allows for the rapid fabrication of large structures, like housing frames or greenhouse structures, without human manual labor.
It completely removes the construction crew from the equation.
It does.
But wait, you still need to be an engineer to run this stuff, right? I can't just walk up to a 5-axis mill and start making turbine blades. I'd probably lose a finger.
That is the bottleneck that the epistemic or knowledge layer tries to solve. The proposal talks about an AI-driven design ecosystem.
They call it a neurosemantic layer, right?
Yes, they envision an AI platform using neural CFD, that is computational fluid dynamic solvers.
So the AI essentially acts as a tutor.
More like a safety net and a co-pilot. You tell it, I need a water pump that moves 50 gallons a minute. The AI designs it, but it also validates the physics.
It runs the simulation to prove the pump won't just explode when you turn it on.
Exactly. It democratizes the ability to design valid machinery. It is very similar to what Marcin Jakubowski is doing with open source ecology.
The global village construction set.
Right, and also concepts from Jeremy Rifkin regarding the zero marginal cost society. But here, it is massively accelerated by AI.
Okay, so you have the machines, but machines still cost money. Land costs money. Even with epoxy granite, $14,000 is real money.
It is.
How does the community actually pull this off without going bankrupt? This is where the source introduces the economic exit.
They call it the Infrastructure Ratchet.
I love that term, because a ratchet only moves one way.
Exactly. You turn it, it clicks, and it holds. It doesn't slip back.
The financial rule here is incredibly strict. You never start a new phase of expansion until the previous phase is owned completely debt-free.
You do not leverage your future to pay for the present. That is the core economic principle here.
Let's walk through the phases of this ratchet. Phase I and II are about the absolute basics, land and energy.
Right. You use cooperative bulk purchasing to buy land and LTO batteries.
Lithium titanate oxide.
Yes. These batteries last decades. The source specifically mentions getting solar down to 50 cents per watt.
And the physical goal here is a south-facing greenhouse living unit.
You live inside a structure that actively grows your food and generates your power simultaneously.
And they mentioned backing that up with baseload SMRs, small modular reactors, so you aren't completely dependent on the grid when the sun isn't shining.
Exactly. Once you have shelter and energy that you own outright, meaning no utility bills and no mortgage interest, you move to phase 3.
Equipment acquisition. This is where you bring in that high-throughput automation we talked about for daily essentials.
The examples the source gives here are hilarious but amazing. Bread lines that pump out 1,800 loaves an hour.
Shampoo and toothpaste lines.
It sounds mundane, but think about the massive markup on those everyday items.
They also mention circular knitting machines for clothes. The text claims this level of local automation can drop the cost of diapers to just 10 cents per unit.
When you control the energy and the machinery, the cost of goods falls to the floor. You aren't paying for the brand, the marketing, the shipping, or the corporate overhead.
You are literally just paying for the raw materials and the electrons.
And phase 4 is labor. But this is the part that surprised me the most when reading it. They only hire local labor after the overheads are completely zeroed out.
That is a critical economic pivot. In a normal business, labor is a cost you try to minimize.
You fire people to save money.
Right. But in this model, because your energy and rent costs are effectively zero, you can afford to pay people simply to operate the system.
Because the system exists to support the community, not to generate profit for an external shareholder.
It effectively decouples labor from survival.
It does.
Okay, so we have the hardware, we have the economic model, but there's a massive section in this deep dive called the epistemic stack.
This is about the software running in our heads, law and education.
And this is arguably the most ambitious part of the whole document.
It is. You can build all the factories you want, but the source argues that a society with sovereign manufacturing will still fail if the people remain intellectually dependent.
If your mind is trapped in the old system, you will just recreate the old system using new machines.
And the biggest trap, according to the text, is the legal system itself. It calls current law easy to vary and deeply ambiguous.
Think about how law works today. It is written in natural language. English, French, whatever. It is messy.
Words have double meanings. A judge can interpret a comma in 5 different ways.
This ambiguity creates an endless need for lawyers, judges, and lengthy court battles. It is incredibly inefficient.
So what is the alternative they propose?
The proposal is to replace ambiguous legal language with a Montague-Lodgebon legal stack.
Montague-Lodgebon. That genuinely sounds like a sci-fi character.
It really does. Unpack that for us.
Lodgebon is a constructed language. It was invented by linguists to be syntactically unambiguous. In English, if I say, "I saw the man with the telescope," it is completely unclear. Did I use a telescope to see him? Or did he have a telescope?
Right, the phrasing is ambiguous.
But in Lodgebon, the grammar makes the meaning mathematically precise. There's absolutely no confusion.
And Montague grammar.
It is a way to map language directly to mathematical logic. So the idea is to make laws into computable theorems.
So instead of arguing in a courtroom, you just compile the code of the law.
Essentially, yes. The source says an unconstitutional law shouldn't just be overturned by a judge. It should fail to compile because it violates runtime invariance.
That is fascinating.
Imagine the Constitution is the operating system kernel.
Okay.
If the Constitution says freedom of speech is absolute, and a local municipality tries to pass a law restricting it, the legal system, the actual digital ledger of law, would reject it as a syntax error.
That is truly mind-bending. It removes the human element of corruption or bias from the interpretation of law completely.
It connects to work being done right now at the Stanford Codex Center for Legal Informatics. They are actively working on computable contracts.
And the source draws heavily on Dov Gabby's work as well.
Yes, his work in deontic logic. That is the logic of obligation and permission. The goal is trying to turn justice into a math problem that has a single, correct, verifiable answer.
But you cannot have mathematical law if people cannot think logically. Which brings us to the education component.
The source calls the current school system the P12 racket.
It is a very harsh critique. It views traditional schooling not as education, but as a mechanism for creating mass dependency.
The source heavily references Ivan Illich here, specifically his book, Deschooling Society.
Illich argued that institutional education essentially teaches you to need the institution.
You learn that learning only happens in a classroom, just like you learn that health only happens in a hospital.
And the proposal claims that if you withdrew just 35% of students from the public system, the state educational bureaucracy would financially collapse in 3 to 5 years.
It is a strategy of starvation. You just stop feeding the beast.
And what do they replace it with? They call it a neuroadaptive AI curriculum.
This is where the tech gets very intimate. They describe a completely paperless system where students wear EEG scalp hats.
Scalp hats that monitor cognitive load and eye tracking.
Yes.
I have to be honest, that sounds a little dystopian to me. Monitoring the kids' brains while they learn.
It definitely raises some major privacy red flags. But the goal stated in the text is hyper-efficiency. The AI adapts the pace of learning in real time based directly on how the brain is responding.
So if you are bored, it speeds up the material. If you are confused, it slows down.
Exactly. It detects the precise moment of understanding neurologically.
And the curriculum they are feeding into these hats isn't just standard history and geography.
No, it is extremely heavy on formal logic, Montague grammar, and Lodgebon. They want these kids to be totally fluent in the code that runs the new legal system.
They want a generation that inherently thinks in theorems.
But there is a counterbalance. They also mandate a physical mastery track.
I loved this part because it definitely balances out the brain in a bat vibe of the EEG hats, martial arts and survival skills.
Right. To ensure students aren't captured by the digital world, you need a population that is logically rigorous and technologically sovereign, but also physically capable.
It is a very Spartan meets Silicon Valley aesthetic. They want philosopher-engineers who can build a house, write a law in code, and physically defend themselves.
So let's zoom out for a second. We have the diagnosis of manufactured scarcity.
We have the hardware to escape it via the industrial stack.
We have the economic ratchet to fund it debt-free.
And we have the mental software to sustain it through computable law and neuroadaptive education. What does this all actually lead to? What is the end game of this structural prison break?
The source defines the end state with a very specific technical phrase: the global maxima of allowable freedom and the global minima of rulemaking.
That is a beautiful phrase.
It is. The core idea is a post-institutional operating system for humanity.
Because if you automate production so everyone has exactly what they need, and you decentralize energy so no one can turn off your lights,
And you ensure that everyone understands the underlying mathematical logic of the law.
the historical justification for governance just evaporates.
Because why do we have a state in the first place?
Yeah.
To manage scarcity and to solve disputes.
Right.
If there is no scarcity and disputes are solved objectively by code, what is the state actually for? The source says in this system, the cost of human dignity becomes essentially zero.
Meaning it costs nothing to live a free and dignified life.
And that is the true why it matters here. Whether or not you think this specific plan is completely feasible, and let's be honest, the level of coordination required to build robotic cubes and have everyone learn Lodgebend is staggering.
It is a massive undertaking.
It is, but it forces us to look at our current problems completely differently.
It shifts the frame. We usually think of poverty or corruption as moral failings. We blame greedy corporations or corrupt politicians.
But this source says no, those are simply engineering failures. They are inefficiencies in the stack.
And it deeply challenges the notion of impossible compliance. The source suggests that we are currently living in a system that demands things we cannot give and promises things it cannot deliver.
The ambition here is to build a completely parallel system that aligns with physical reality, with physics and logic, so that freedom isn't a gift you receive from the government.
It is just a byproduct of how the machinery actually works.
It connects the dots between a granite machine vibrating in a garage and a mathematical theorem defining your fundamental rights. It is a holistic view of freedom that we very rarely see.
It asks us to just stop asking for permission. It actually reminds me of that one quote from the source material. Ethical resistance is not violent overthrow. It is the transparent construction of parallel technologies.
It is a heavy concept. Usually we try to end with a simple takeaway, but this whole deep dive has been one giant takeaway about the fragility of the systems we currently live in.
I think the most provocative thought to leave you with is this. The source argues that authority relies entirely on us believing there is no other way. It relies on a fundamental lack of imagination.
Right. We think the grocery store is the absolute only way to get food. We think the courthouse is the only way to get justice.
But if technology has reached a point where we can generate our own energy, build our own industrial tools, and mathematically verify our own laws, does the state exist because it must?
Or does it exist simply because we haven't built the alternative yet?
That is the ultimate question. If the prison door is actually unlocked, are we staying inside just out of habit?
Something to think about the next time you pay your utility bill.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive.